before we begin, let me first give a brief introduction of Energy CoLab. So Energy CoLab is a youth-led initiative that seeks to reduce barriers that Singaporean youth face in contributing to energy issues. We came together through a shared interest in sustainable energy transitions and a desire to make local energy systems knowledge more accessible to young people in Singapore. Through conversations, we found that energy topics tend to have a high barrier to entry due to the perception of it being very technical in nature, and hence opportunities to engage in energy topics tend to be available only to those who are trained in this niche area, and learning is much more individualized within formal education settings. So energy solutions are often presented as very technological fixes to the climate crisis, and through our engagements, we hope to bring different stakeholders together to touch on the human dimensions of energy transitions through a lens of justice and equity. And on a collective level, we also hope to equip youth with the knowledge and confidence to understand and contribute to sustainable energy solutions. And we want to do this by designing meaningful learning and networking opportunities and having an informal space to learn together. And this community conference is actually our first public-facing initiative. Yeah. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists for this session. So we have with us first is Gwyneth. So Gwyneth is an assistant editor at Kontinentalist, a Singapore-based data storytelling studio. So she contributes to planning, writing, and editing stories, and also helps to analyze and visualize data for published works and projects. Next, we also have Rahul. So Rahul has held a lifelong passion for sustainability and environment, and she has worked for climate advocacy in Singapore for the past 7 years, believing that empowering individuals and communities to take climate action is critical. She facilitates climate fresque workshops and is the country lead, growing awareness of climate change exponentially through this game-based workshop. And as a climate conversations facilitator and corporate lead, she reaches out to people in communities and companies to engage them on systemic solutions to the issue. Her other interests also include wildlife, traveling, and martial arts. And last but not the least, we have Wyman. So Wyman is an environment correspondent and the assistant editor of Eco-Business, an independent media and business intelligence platform that tracks sustainable development and ESG in Asia Pacific. She has a decade of experience in media and leads Eco-Business's coverage on China. She also covers a broad range of issues in her current role, from climate change to green finance and biodiversity conservation. So she's based in Singapore and is a regular commentator on civil society, politics, as well as environmental and social issues. So now we'll move on to our first segment, which is where we'll have each panelist share a little more about their work before we move on to our panel discussion later. So we'll first start off with Gwyneth. I will stop my screen share.
Okay, sorry, I was muted. Hello, hi everyone. Can you see my slide well? I hope so. Okay, so hi, I'm Gwyneth. I'm an assistant editor at this company called Kontinentalist. My background is in wildlife and environmental research, and I joined Kontinentalist in January 2020, originally as a writer. So I got into this line of work because it was basically a mix of skills that I enjoyed, which was, research work, data analysis, and writing. Yeah, so so we're part of this company. It's called Kontinentalist, and basically our main goal is to bridge the gap between research and the public. And we also place focus on Asian stories and topics to tell stories about the region in a meaningful and respectful way. Let me click on this. Yeah, so we do a variety of work involving data storytelling and creating data visualizations. And one of the main things that we do is to turn research into engaging data stories that we then publish on our website. So what that means is that our stories are originally led by the data. We analyze the data, try to find a deeper message within the data set, and then write our story based on that message. So some of the examples of the data stories that we have published, one of them, the one on the left, is a story that we worked with BirdLife International on. And we basically created a data story about the need to conserve migratory birds. And for this, we use interactive maps, a lot of movements, and various visualizations to bring the story across. And then the one on the right is about the Rohingya refugee crisis. This one we worked with UNHCR, and it's also a very interactive and sort of meaningful data story that we've created. Yeah, I'll share the links a bit later on. Yeah. So nowadays we are very lucky to be approached by some very incredible partners. Usually they are cause-driven organizations who have done a lot of research in their cause and want to share a bigger message with a more general audience. So we work with them basically to make their main messages into data stories that are eye-catching and engaging for a wider audience. So yeah, that's this is just a quick overview of some of the stories that we have published before, and that's it for my introduction. So very nice to meet everyone, and I'm just gonna quickly send over the links to the stories. Yeah, but that's about it.
Thank you, Gwyneth. Okay, so next we will have Rahul for sharing.
Hi, can you hear me? Oh, I have, I don't have screen sharing.
Oh. Okay, let me,
I'm saying it says I'm disabled.
Okay.
I think I just need to be, I'm a co-host.
Okay.
All right, just a second. Okay. All right, so can everyone see my screen? I hope I'm clear.
Yep.
Okay, great. So thank you, Gwyneth, for that very quick, very short sort of introduction. And I'm here to talk to you on behalf of Climate Conversations. And I will get into a little bit about how Climate Conversations sort of tries to bridge the gap, let's say, between all these data stories and the segment which is going to come afterwards from eco-business, from environment, about how to bridge those, how to bridge the gap between, let's say, the human-centric part, the intrinsic motivation for why climate action sort of does not get taken to the scale at which we would like to see it. So that's going to be the focus of my a very quick introduction. Before I sort of start off very quickly about myself, I've been for a few years in climate advocacy, and how I got interested in this field is, well, I was sort of born into a family of environmentalists, very passionate. I came up in the morning session, how youth are always very interested in wildlife. That was really my in as well into this movement. I always saw myself on some Greenpeace whaling ship, wearing bandanas and waving flags, but not to be. Just happened to do my MBA. And got into the regular working life, quick stint in media and then some sort of FMCG. But my awakening really came when I sort of contrasted my working style with that, with what I was more tuned to, and that was primarily my father's and my grandfather's, who both worked in the public sector, and where I saw a tremendous interaction with public needs, community engagement, and sort of building. So one was my grandfather worked in the roads sector, trying to reach to remote villages, and that was some of the his community engagement, looking through the government means to actually satisfy the requirements of the community, whether it was medical, schools, marketplaces, access to goods and services. All of these were actively taken on by him. And of course, I'm talking quite a few years back now in remote villages in North India. I was very privileged to see him work on some of my summer holidays. And as opposed to my way of working, we drilled down to advertising, typically at the end of the month, sales targets, how much of product was being created and pushed down our sales and distribution channels. It was just all that we were looking for. There was no social outcome. There were no other outcomes. We did not care about the waste that was generated. This was in Mumbai. Often Mumbai will see a lot of flooding in the monsoon season. Primarily plastic packaging is some of the reasons. As in the FMCG industry, I might have been an active contributor, and this was not something that I was addressing during my work at all. However, in contrasting deeply with the way I saw the work, my father and my grandfather work, and shift over to Singapore. And this is when I became a mother. That's when I thought this is not the best way to be actually. This is not the value system that I want to actually leave back for my children. So that was really my aim to sort of starting my environmental journey and my journey to advocacy. So why do we? Why do we? We have all this data, we have everything, all this understanding. Some of these slides are also, some of this data is also from the time when environmentalism was less of a buzzword. But when we look at how many people are actually interested, and this is data from a pre-conversation survey. So before we have done a survey, before we have done a conversation, you can see what a high number of people actually prioritize climate change. It's almost 50%. However, do we see 50% of people actually taking climate action? Unfortunately not. And this is what is at the heart of climate conversations, to really try and understand what are the barriers to actually getting people to take climate action, and getting ourselves to sort of address those barriers. And I'm sure you can resonate with all of these. Often we come up with the scale of the issue. It's something that you did not create. It has not been created in one day. And all our actions seem to be at individual levels. The isolation of, again, taking climate action, often you are that lone person avoiding that straw, that bringing your own reusable bag, but people up and down ahead of you, they just don't seem to care. And often this can make you very, very isolated. And then, of course, the difficulty of actually taking climate action. All our systems are embedded in climate, in the fossil fuel industry. As we grow richer, consumption is naturally what grows. It's worthwhile to see in that just transition how much of the lifestyles of the rich are actually responsible for what percentage of actual emissions, and that can be quite a learning point. So what Climate Conversations does is that we want to sort of bridge this gap through its unique conversation model. So what are the ingredients of this? Very quickly, these ingredients of this conversation, it's not something that we do not give a lecture. It's actually just a facilitated conversation. Participants make their own connections on how their values are impacted or how the scientific interactions work. We want for people to be able to verbalize how these interconnections, how their values interact actually with the climate crisis, so that we trigger their intrinsic motivation to take climate action. And very key to it, very key to our model, listening very carefully so that we can actually guide participants to come across, to help build those very critical connections and not sort of be prescriptive in our approach. So this is how it actually works. We try and address these sort of barriers to these small groups and creating a safe space. Often people are, they fail to verbalize what they worry about. Individuality of taking small action, the fact that their small actions do not actually have a big scale impact. These are all some of the concerns that come up. We overcome this through this small groups, safe space concept. We connect individuals, not roles, through small groups. So it's not about connecting your abilities. It is actually connecting your heart, your values to the climate crisis. It's about connecting your intrinsic emotion and bring out your motivation to actually engage with climate action at all levels. So again, as I said, we try and build those interconnections. We try and also support this cultural shift, whether it is through engagement with sort of families or in a little space of community, or let's say a bunch of walkers, etc. So this is sort of how we are trying to bridge this gap, and our aim being to get people who walk away from our small-scale workshops and conversations to actually understand the importance and urgency of climate action. We want to ensure that they are empowered to take actually meaningful action and also be able to trigger collective action. And one of the very important points that we actually do, ways that we actually do this, is to try and broaden people's perspective on how they can actually take meaningful scaled climate action, getting them to sort of realize their spheres of influence as a citizen, as somebody who votes, as a consumer, as people who, we are the people who enable banks to be, to have all those, to have the money to be able to give loans, let's say. So these are all some of the ways, making the right asks is all some of the ways that we can actually get people to take action. What is the result of this? You can see that overwhelmingly about 93% of our supporters will actually agree with climate change, with the collective power of being able to take climate change, address climate change. They're also significantly more hopeful. They're also much more likely to take action. So just to conclude, 3 things that we do. Communication, we feel, is key. Really sort of bringing that intrinsic, linking people to their intrinsic motivation, their emotion and intrinsic motivation to actually take action. And it's surprising how few, how most people will resonate across about 150 conversations that we have. Values like justice, humanity, care for family, for the community, for migrant workers. These are very common values that actually come up. So we find a lot of people actually do resonate with these. We allow participants to take ownership. You get to verbalize everything, whether it's in the workshop, building science connections, whether you are actually getting people to build the value connections to their values, and what is the actions which they can take. Again, we only provide them a basic guideline. After that, people verbalize their own actions, and they do it in their groups of people. That's when they're more likely to sort of get followed through as well. So I think that is a very quick, short way of that we sort of approach climate change and getting people to take action on climate change in a very human-centric, way, and getting people to connect, getting people to connect with their own motivations and intrinsic values to address climate change. Yeah, so that's it about from my end. I can stop the share now. Thank you.
Thank you, Raju. Your workshops sound very interesting. I personally haven't been to any of them, but would love to join in one of them sometime.
We'd be delighted to have you.
Okay. Next, we will have Wyman from Eco Business. So feel free to start your sharing anytime.
Sure. I won't be sharing any slides. I'm going to take a very different approach to the introduction. Thank you, Rati, for the earlier introduction. Really good afternoon, everyone. I was thinking it's a Saturday and having a very informal conversation would be really nice. To be very honest, I thought long and hard about the best way to say the most about this very difficult topic, facilitating and communicating a just transition in the shortest time possible. I'm going to keep the introduction of my company, myself, very brief, while actually making the most of this 5 to 7 minutes at the start to put forth some questions and points that I think could be helpful for the discussion. My name is Wyman. I'm the assistant editor at Eco Business, and I write for and help to manage its editorial team. We're made up of about 8 to 10 regional correspondents and writers across Asia, including in Singapore, Malaysia, Philippines, Cambodia, India and China. So we do have some like boots on the ground. Eco-Business essentially is an environmental and business intelligence platform focused on looking at sustainability issues with an Asia-Pacific lens, quite similar to some of the work that Kontinentalist is doing. I think Gwyneth was sharing. And I think that includes looking at climate and energy. I would say we occupy quite a unique space in Asian media, given that we are business facing and have good access to like key opinion leaders who are actually making those decisions that would or would not help accelerate the energy transition that is much needed. So at the same time, this gives us huge responsibility, because while we may say we want to practice thought leadership and move our partners along this journey that we believe in, we all know how hard it is to like persuade and convince, especially the private sector, when there are some people who are still quite set in their old ways, and we're looking at decision makers here. I think how I'd like to like start this conversation would be to also ask my fellow panelists, the moderator, as well as like participants in the session, like when we say climate and energy policy communication, ultimately, who are we trying to serve, and communication for whom? I think this is especially critical when asked in the context of a just transition, or when we say like leave no one behind. These are phrases that as a journalist I've become increasingly wary of, because we are seeing them being used, overused, or even co-opted into mainstream discourse, sometimes by the very people whom we might think are furthest from who we imagine would be talking about the importance of social justice. And it's a key concept that's very linked to just transitions that we are talking about today. So I think here in the Singapore context, I'm talking about the government, regulators, and of course about the financiers and the banks whom we write so much about. So I think just to clarify, don't get me wrong, I don't mean to say that like there is no value in the idea of a just transition, but what I mean is exactly the opposite. We need to be cautious that the phrase just transition is not a stock phrase that becomes an excuse for important institutions to go slow. And I think increasingly we are seeing it in mainstream discourse, in speeches by ministers, by banks. Just last week, I went for a UOB press conference whereby they discussed their interim targets as well as their 2050 climate targets on decarbonization. And I think it's already expected that in the speech of the CEO, we see the word just transition in Southeast Asia. So, I mean, it's been appearing so much. And so I think one example, I'm not sure if those like following banks and their climate pledges remember a speech made recently by DBS Chief Piyush Gupta, where he cites the moral dilemmas posed by coal and palm oil industries. I find this example very intriguing and interesting. It is a very compelling speech by the head of Southeast Asia's biggest bank, explaining how DBS is like existing new coal-related financing, a decision made a few years ago, was like one of the hardest decisions he's ever had to make. So here I quote him, a rather long quote. Maybe I should have like prepared a presentation slide, but anyway, you can close your eye to listen to it if you can't like concentrate. What do you say to kids in Semarang or somewhere in the middle of Indonesia who are struggling to get electricity, to do their studies or eat their food? For us to say, I'm going to make a moral judgment on electricity use, and I think here when he says us, it means the banks, is less important because the planetary considerations are more important. Piyush asks, am I the right person to say that? There are about 14 million households in Indonesia and Sumatra who rely on small estate palm oil for a living. As a financier, is it right for us to play God? I would say that the narrative is super powerful because it appeals to our empathy that the decisions that DBS or any other banks are making take full consideration of these communities that are cited. But at the end of the day, we all know the narrative is problematic. And at the same time, you're seeing it repeated in many media organizations, maybe just like taking that speech and quoting it. And I think this is where maybe the community, including like the media, needs to reflect. while there is validity, I think, in his point that like firms and banks are not able to change their business models overnight, reporting on such storytelling, I think, should not take away our attention on scrutinizing the bank's goals. In this case, if the banks are making ambitious enough pledges, are there interim targets made and for which sectors? What is the bank's renewable portfolios? Why does it need until 2039 to completely exit coal? And I think this is precisely what eco-business has been trying to cover as much as we can and ask as much as we can. Maybe sometimes not enough, and maybe sometimes we do it in the wrong way as well. So, I mean, I think the editorial team always reflects upon like how we cover some topics. And lastly, I wanted to end by saying that like as a regional organization, we also find it very challenging to just talk about just transitions in the Singapore context. I think the region, especially Southeast Asia, should be seen as a whole, especially when there are important conversations about how energy-related like moonshot plans, such as hydrogen development, blue carbon, and the building of like a Southeast Asia energy grid is so complex. And in EB or eco-business, we have this like Southeast Asian clean energy transition portal, which I'll share the link to later, where we especially curate writings and reportings on the issue. Mostly for us, what we specialize is longer form writing. Other than energy, there are issues such as plastic, waste colonialism, and narratives that surround all these like very complex topics that I would really want to bring up, but maybe not elaborate on in the interest of time. I think for Singapore, what's of interest now is definitely carbon taxation. For most parts, I believe that the Singapore economy is shaped in a way whereby equity has to be ensured by making sure that policies on the whole are redistributional in a just way. And that's not only about like keeping, for example, like electricity prices low, but generally we're talking about cost of living, right? So at the same time, you're looking at like much higher order issues. For example, how trade unions are organized, tripartism. At the end of the day, it's political credibility that we're looking at also. So I think that's kind of like beyond us as an environmental like niche organization. But I think in the broader conversation, it is something that we can continue to talk about. And so as just a last note, for eco-business, our team is also on the ground at COP27, which is kicking off on Sunday, tomorrow, happening for about 2 weeks. And loss and damage is going to be a huge issue, and that concerns Southeast Asia and developing countries as well. So keep a lookout for our updates. And I guess everyone can actually just tune in to their YouTube broadcast from COP27 if you're interested, and really track like the smaller and developing countries, what their leaders are saying. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Waiman. You already asked quite a few important questions that I hope that we'll be able to also bring into the discussion later. Okay, so right now, since we have heard from all three panelists, we'll basically just move on to the discussion segment. So for the audience members, feel free to just type your questions into the Zoom chat, or you may also message me privately if you wish to remain anonymous. Okay, I will just spotlight everyone for Okay, so we'll just start off first with some warm-up questions before the audience questions roll in. So firstly, I think we have heard from all of you about your specific types of communication when it comes to environmental reporting or conversation. But the first question would be, what do you think the role of storytelling and communication is, specifically to environmental issues and a just transition? And why do you think environmental communication is different from other types of communication? So for anyone who is ready, you can just feel free to begin.
I can start off, I guess, very briefly. I mean, I think storytelling and communication is definitely important. It's just that there are so many different types of communicators right now in the space, and I think everyone plays a very important role. I mean, I don't know whether I'm speaking to the right community here, but anyway, like I feel like what's most important right now actually are public relations and communications for people who actually represent organizations. I mean, be it advocacy organizations or just like the private sector in general, to understand how they should communicate accurately, and also, I mean, because I think there's a very bad light shown on like PR, right? And we're seeing like issues such as greenwashing. But very recently, I think Bloomberg, as well as I think Eco-Business also ran a piece on green hash, whereby communication folks are now quite afraid of coming out to actually communicate their sustainability policies, because they're very afraid of getting the backlash. And I think this is very important because we still need the companies, government, private sector actually communicating to us what is happening, what their stance are, as well as, for example, their ESG and sustainability policy. And I think that is only when like with disclosure, it is when media and communicators on the other end can actually play a meaningful role. So I think that is like highly important. So there is this like very important balance of like public relations being overzealous when like they are trying to put out those eco and like we are sustainable kind of like messages, but at the same time we don't want them to like shush up and then stop talking altogether. I think that is very dangerous. So I don't think we have a good answer to that, but I think for eco-business, what we try to do is really engage all kinds of communicators and get them to tell their story. And then we are the ones who kind of like persuade and convince them that sometimes that way of like storytelling is not the right way, because it's going to reach the wrong audience and get a different response. So yeah, I think that's where I'll add. Thank you.
Okay, I'll also add a little bit. So just from the introductions, I realized that out of the three of us, Kontinentalist is probably the least climate-focused organization out of all the panelists. So actually, to be very honest, I'm the only writer who really focuses on environmental issues. The rest of the team, they're very focused on the other stuff like history, social justice, and things like that. So some of my answers might be a bit more generic, and not so much like climate energy focused. But in response to your question, I guess for us, the main thing is really about the role of storytelling and communication is really about keeping readers engaged. And the reason then, so just now you asked like, how is environmental conversation different from other types? And to me, as someone who writes environmental pieces, and obviously we check our readership, and we look at and we compare it across all of our stories. Some of my insights into all of these analytics is that environmental pieces, usually for us at least, are read by niche audiences. So usually people who are already interested. And I think one of the biggest challenges as a data journalist or as a journalist in general is figuring out how to target audiences who like aren't as invested, or they don't think it's very important, or maybe they're only interested in like one aspect of the environmental conversation. Like they're not interested in energy, but they care about natural disasters, for example. So figuring out how to target these guys are also very important. And then also, nowadays our audience is, so many of them are on social media, and that's also like a totally different platform to tackle digital forms of communication. Figuring out what platform to use is the best for storytelling. And how do we make sure that like when we post something, they actually stay on the post all the way to the end? So for me, the role of storytelling and communication is really about learning how to keep readers engaged. And this is like a continuous sort of iterative process that has no fixed answer and develops as, our readers also have like changing opinions. As the world changes, as society changes, it's also essential to sort of keep up with them. And yeah, I think it's very interesting that Wyman just now mentioned something about, accurate storytelling now with, all that PR. And I really agree with a lot of things she said. Actually, she went during her introduction, I think I learned a lot about the topic specifically. And also, a lot of points I really agreed with her. And I think that's also why, our company at least for Conti, when we write stories, we do like a data focus. So we let the data lead the stories. And I'm not saying that this is the main way to tell accurate stories, but this is one of the ways. And so when I write environmental pieces, you know, I look into the data first, and I sort of tell the story based on the data. And I sort of avoid the sort of like flowery, in a sense, flowery language and things like that. So the idea is really just to, you know, present the facts to the reader as it is, and then try to make a compelling story out of this. So how do we keep the reader on the story, but also let them know that like whatever you're reading, these are the facts, and it's not the writers, you know, coming in with our own opinions and things like that. Obviously, we take a stand and things like that, but the main point is still the data aspect. And so I think that helps to contribute towards accurate storytelling as well. Yeah, so these are some of the points.
I think I'm muted. Yeah, I can just very quickly add in some of the, you know, the principles we sort of use to connect people, to connect with people. We do use a short portion of storytelling as a deep hook to get people engaged, and we use a three, you know, the three tricks of sort of presenting our story with a bit of vulnerability, credibility, and relatability. So vulnerability, so just passing the trust on to the audience by showing that we are not here in a position of, let's say, you know, some kind of a preacher or something that we have solved everything, but we also feel as vulnerable to some of these doubts, or some of you know, some of the doubts, let's say some of these impacts as the next person. I mean, we don't have all the answers either. So just showcasing these three things, a bit of relatability, how do my experiences relate with those of the audience? Again, very, very useful to build on those to sort of, and again, some amount of credibility, the work that you have done, the work that the organization has done to sort of, you know, to some of the work that we share, that what is some of the work that we have actually done in order for us to build that credibility with our audience so that they also take us a bit more seriously. So those are some of the three tricks that we use in that storytelling to engage our audience, small audiences. Thanks.
Thank you so much for all your answers. That's okay. So I think we talked a lot about engaging our audiences and how to reach a different type of audience other than those who are already interested. So I think another question, a follow-up question from that would be, what are some of the ways that you make what are some of the challenges you face in kind of reaching this audience, and what are some methods that you've tried to overcome that? Yeah. So for example, Wyman, you mentioned that eco-business is more business facing. So how do you approach that? And for Gwyneth also, how do you make the scale of numbers and statistics understandable to the layperson? Yeah, and for Raju, maybe how do you even bring up environment in a day-to-day conversation? Yeah.
Yeah, I just came from a 2 to 3 day like digital media conference, and there was so much discussion about data analytics and understanding your audience. And I think as a small outfit, I mean, we're not huge, so we're really like small and medium sized, and we don't really have the resources to track on a very daily basis and have very accurate data on whether we're reaching to the right audience. So I mean, like that past few days was really like a learning experience also, just to like taking tips from those bigger organizations on what they're doing. For my background, I used to come from a much bigger like newsroom as well, and a mainstream press. And then I think you can immediately see that there is limitation when you don't get hold of data. Are we reaching out to the right audience? Other than that limitation, I think another challenge that eco-business has is because we are business facing. And right now, climate is so much on the agenda of so many like private sector organizations, right? And at the same time, we also do sponsorships and sponsored content and partnerships. So over the past year, what we've been trying very, very hard to do is actually building up a content studio so that we can separate our independent journalists work from studio writers who actually work much more closely with clients, whereby they have specific messages, and that disclosure of like which articles, for example, comes under the content studio and which ones are really like from ourselves. I think it's very important for the readers. And with a small outfit, there's only so much you can do because I think at the end of the day, a lot of us journalists who actually join the organization want to really do that independent journalism rather than really write for a brand. But at the same time, your brand identity is really working with businesses at the same time. So there's always that balance that we have to strike, and we also struggle to strike as well. So I will leave it at this like 2 points. And I think it's something that we're still trying to work on and overcome. Yeah.
Yeah, so for us, yeah, just to contextualize. Well, first of all, I was there at the Digital Media Awards thing. I didn't go for the full conference, but yeah, I didn't meet you actually, so that's a waste. But yeah, I was there too. But okay, so at Conti, I guess we are also a pretty small team. And so we had to so everyone, even though we have our own roles, we have to basically utilize people's skill sets that are kind of outside of the role. So for instance, our previous editorial lead, thankfully, he had a bit of like marketing audience analysis sort of skills. So we basically sort of tapped on that and did a quick, not really a quick thing. He spent like a few months sort of doing like an audience analysis. And so to really answer your question is that we sort of, we do this audience analysis and then we divide our audience into groups. So when we write a story, even at the pitching stage, we already are thinking about who the story is for and, what audience are we targeting? Because even among audiences that are interested in environmental topics, there are, like I said, there are people who are different, who are interested in different aspects of environmental topics. So for instance, the two broad groups that we divided into is like people who are already interested and people who are not so interested in environmental topics. So when we write a story, are we writing it for people who are already interested? Because usually those stories are usually deeper dives into things that they already know about, but they might not have the data or they might not have seen any sort of analysis on this. So for instance, we did a story about like a deep dive into the number of environmental related parliamentary questions being asked in Parliament every year. And we basically like scoured through Hansard, which is basically, it's publicly available, but people don't really have the time or effort to like scour through that. And so putting into story, putting into perspective also gives people who are interested, environmentalists basically, a different resource for conversation. And then there are those who are, not so interested in the environmental topic. So in those cases, then our stories would be mostly about raising awareness, bringing messages across. So, a bit more, I guess it sounds terrible when I say this, but a bit more surface level stuff. But the thing is that the communications for this kind of topics is a bit different. You have to understand that you're speaking to someone who might be a layperson to certain, terms and concepts. And so your writing is also a little different. And also nowadays, like I said, so basically our main audience are millennials and Gen Zs who are extremely active on social media. And one thing that we've noticed, so we did our audience analysis, and one thing that we've noticed is that they like to read it on Instagram, but they don't want to like click on the link in our bio to go to the full story. So because of that, we developed stories that only live on our Instagram. So instead of like, it being a preview for the main story, we basically created data stories that only live on our Instagram. And so like for us, in terms of communications, we also like heavily focus on the social media side, because that's where our audience is basically. So it's a little different from eco-business and a little different from climate conversations as well. But I think the concept is the same, right? So all three of us have different audience styles, different audience groups. And so it's about targeting and understanding, you know, where they are at and what they want to read from you. Yeah.
Great, thanks. I can also very quickly just add on to that, in our conversations and our workshops, climate literacy is a key part. You know, we do want to make sure people are taking away some verified some of the verified facts. And in the climate stress workshops, we lean exclusively on the IPCC reports. So it's just a very accessible way to understand the science behind climate change, and it's a game-based workshop. So again, this game is actually based completely on the IPCC report. So again, communicating very, very clearly, but in a very accessible manner, and really particularly to come down to to not losing that scientific rigor is very, very critical. If the same goes with our conversations, we make sure that we are talking to people with some of the facts that are going to be hard-hitting. Deforestation, it's close to happens in a big way in Indonesia. And again, what are the impacts in terms of haze and others that we see on Singaporean on populations? What are some of the other key drivers of climate change? And we present these very simply. One of our tenets is that we want for people to discuss climate issues. We want for them to be able to bring this up as part of their social conversations. And that is one of the key drivers. That is one of our key, one of the key deliverables of our formats, that people should feel empowered and know enough of the science to be able to talk about climate change, scientific facts in social settings, so that through talking is also one of the big action points that we actually lean upon. The more people we have who are able to talk in a correct manner, in a knowing manner about these facts, will actually engage more and more people. Thank you.
I just wanted to jump in there very quickly to also say that, I mean, because since we are talking about like reaching out also to the mass audience, I think one issue that has, that keeps cropping up is really news fatigue. And because we had our Sustainability Media Academy recently, 3 sessions of it, and there are aspiring journalists as well as like established journalists joining the academy. And one very interesting topic that I still don't have an answer to, which is this thing about doomsday journalism, whereby I think we are very, very privileged now in Singapore, whereby we can treat it as a choice. Do I want this journalism or do I not want this journalism? But a lot of times when you speak to journalists in Southeast Asia or Asia, and they're not based in Singapore, and they are facing extreme weather events, their livelihoods are being affected, and we have journalists on the ground who are covering issues like that, then there is no option whereby you have to cover that issue. And I think it's a way of how do you actually craft your storytelling to make the stories matter. But sometimes I don't even think it's an either or, whereby we can say, let's have solutions journalism, whereby we talk about the positive and the optimistic solutions. But I think there are communities around, maybe not in Singapore, that needs us to actually tell that kind of story, whereby what is actually happening on the ground? Who are the people being affected by the energy transition? I think we can't really avoid that, yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. I think that's a nice segue to the next question, which is how do you then contextualize these issues to readers in Singapore? So for example, a lot of issues are happening in neighboring countries, but they're not very relatable to people in Singapore. So yeah, what are some ways to make environmental news relevant to Singaporeans? And also, why is it even important to focus on these regions as well?
Should I start first? Okay. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, like I think like some of the points were said prior to us, and on my notes I put down 3 words: we don't, haha. So yeah, it's quite funny because I mean I know the importance of contextualization, and we definitely do backgrounding for our reporting, but we also recognize that we face a larger like regional audience. But I think what we try to do is we try to cover, because we're based in Singapore, we try to cover Singapore as much as possible given our limited resources as well. And this is also, I mean, connecting to, for example, activists, decision makers in Singapore. And at Eco Business, we also hold quite a lot of like events and partnerships and do research. So I have other colleagues who are not journalists, but they work on actually creating these forums and conversations that bring key like business and decision makers, organizations, as well as like the mass public together. We have been in the editorial team, we have been also thinking about how do we have this like face-to-face chats with like our audience in Singapore, for example, since we are based here, to really listen and hear about what they're interested to understand about. And I think it's a bit I mean, I don't think it's the case that Singaporeans don't care about Southeast Asia. In fact, a lot of our Southeast Asian stories or Asian-specific stories or even global stories such as COP27 has a huge Singapore following. And I think people are actually hungry for this news that are not only like about Singapore, but about what's happening in the region. I think in the introduction, I mentioned like the energy grid. And there is like, for example, imports from Laos. And when I say mass public, maybe not only like the general audience, but general public, but I mean, even like small and medium enterprises in Singapore who are business owners, they would want to know like how these plans in Southeast Asia affect them, challenges, as well as opportunities. I mean, some of them might be thinking of like venturing into specific sectors that look at that. And I think this reporting are quite important as well. Yeah.
Yeah, so very interesting point that Wyman brought up. No, we don't, haha. Because my answer is also basically the same. All right, so honestly, most of our audiences are Singaporeans and or US people. So we believe that it's probably the Asian community in the United States that, really likes our stories. But the thing is that we don't, because we focus more on an Asia thing, and just now Wyman mentioned that, looking at Singapore sometimes for certain topics is a bit restrictive. Sometimes you really do have to look at the region, because obviously Singapore's having a good time, but like the rest of the region, not so much. And, because we're, landlocked, we're not landlocked, but we are like protected and things like that. So we are, in a sense, from a privileged place, and that is also something that I've noticed in our stories. So our environmental pieces on Singapore are usually quite lighthearted in a sense. We talk about like price of sustainability, a bit of human-wildlife conflict and things like that. But I think it's an interesting point that it's not that Singaporeans don't care. They do care about what's happening in the region, and they do care about like heavier, more impactful topics. So what we've noticed, sorry, let me formulate my thoughts a little bit. But what we've noticed is that our readership for heavier, impactful topics that may or may not take place in Singapore, even whether they are environmental topics or not, tend to be higher. And so people do care, and there's no need to like contextualize a foreign problem for Singaporeans, because it is as it is, right? And it's obviously very impactful, obviously very important for them to take note of. So there's no need to like baby our baby our audience in a sense, because they know what's going on and they know the severity of it. And if we tell it in a truthful and genuine manner, that's, you know, that's the kind of like reading that they want to have. So that's also great. But one thing, I guess this is a little bit slightly off tangent from the original question, but one question that was asked when I did like a short interview with a more senior journalist was, you know, first of all, the question is about how do we contextualize problems for Singaporeans, but from the writer's side, Singapore, like I said, Singapore has a good time. The rest of the region, not so much. So a lot of the journalists in the other parts of the region sometimes have a sort of prejudice against Singaporean journalists, because, you know, when we write about certain things, we come from, I mean, admittedly, a sort of privileged place, a sort of, you know, a place of safety, and we don't face the sort of problem, we don't understand the severity of it. And so the question is that, like, so why should Singaporean journalists, like, why should readers from other regions listen to Singaporean journalists, like, you know? And so in that sense, as journalists, writing with nuance and with sensitivity is also very important. And so it's less about contextualizing it for our audience, but more about coming from the journalist's point of view, writing in a more respectful manner. And yeah, and I'm not sure if that answers your question, but basically, you know, that's also something that I think Singaporean journalists needs to take note of. Yeah.
I can add on, and as I said during my presentation, you know, this is something, this massive awareness of an interest in environmental issues, which is a bit more recent. But before that, again, we found that people were concerned, and I shared that statistic. It's something that data that has actually been collected from people over 100+ conversations, and almost 50% of people actually did care about climate issues. Now, contextualizing this in a sort of a Singapore context, even if it may not be from the perspective of, let's say, faced natural disasters or whatever, but drilling it down, and that's why we sort of do it from, linked to our human values. People do feel concerned about these impacts, even if they are happening, let's say, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, or wherever else. A lot of Singaporeans are also connected. They have families in Southeast Asian countries. They know people who have experienced impacts of climate change. We have a large expat community as well who have firsthand seen impacts of climate change in terms of, let's say, natural disasters, if we are specifically talking about those. But the moment you start to drill down to people's values, how do these sort of disasters resonate with our sense of justice, global South versus global North issues. How does it strike our humanity? What do you think are the impacts in community on, let's say, animals, on let's say, access to education? These are all some of those values and things that people care for in our conversations. And we see that people are able to, at the end, draw those impacts. And hence, I mean, I can say with quite a lot of certainty that we have to, by making these connections with human values, be able to overcome this. In the Climate Trust workshops, we are also engaging, there are humanity cards at the end, which talk about the impacts of climate change in terms of food shortages, water shortage, climate conflicts from disease, starvation, and leading to human migrations. And these are again some of the links which people are able to see quite clearly. It's not something which is only in a theoretical concept, but if these disasters happen, and we have all the scientific evidence that we are evaluating, which they are helping to sort of assess and play out and put together in the preceding part of the workshop. When they see that and when they see the outcomes, they do not feel, they are able to see this, as something which we are definitely at the risk of experiencing ourselves even within our lifetimes.
Nice, thank you. I think what I'm getting from all three panelists is really like viewing the audience not just as a passive, like person who is taking in everything, but also they are able to make their own value judgments and be more discerning about what they are consuming, which is, I think, quite empowering, and also maybe makes the job a bit easier for the journalist. So I think, so I think going off on that, I think since we're talking about also other communities in Asia, I'm wondering what are some of the considerations you have when you're writing about impacted communities and writing about accountability? Not just writing, but also speaking as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for us, I think the key thing is we really try to have people on the ground speaking to them directly. And so with the journalists that we work with, I think if you read Eco Business, you will realize that the stories are really, I mean, there will be much more stories coming from places that we are actually present in. And that is really for the fact that we want to be as much as possible accurate, and in terms of the voices in our stories, really talking to the people. One thing that COVID-19 has kind of helped actually is that we're seeing a lot of stakeholders in Southeast Asia as well as Asia being very open to interviews being done remotely. And for example, I just concluded working on an organic farming report, and I was able to actually kind of like speak to smallholder farmers and even like experts or organizations who are into organic farming, which very, very far away, like sometimes India, Indonesia, and just speaking to them to understand. Of course, I think we are also very mindful that it's not representative of like the voice of the entire community, especially when we are reporting remotely and from a distant place, whereby there's no really like close proximity, whereby I can see things with my own eyes. So I think that is where like journalism and like judgment comes in, whereby we have a team of editors who also try to make sure that we're as objective as we can and clear in our messaging, such that the story is properly contextualized. Yeah.
So for us, I guess this one is a bit more specific to Kontinentalist's main style of writing, because we do data-driven stories. So, you know, we let the data lead the narrative, right? So the problem with that sometimes is that data can seem a bit impersonal. So, you know, when you're saying like the number of people who were injured in a natural disaster is usually like a big number, you're not really you're just like letting the reader know like this is the number of people who died. But it's very, you know, it's just a number, and sometimes it can be a bit cold to look at. So I guess this is not really an environmental story example, but I mean, recently, not very recently, a few years back, we wrote a story about, you know, a compilation of all the sexual violence cases that took place in Singapore. And, you know, during the drafting stage, as our writer was writing, we realized that sometimes when we use database and we represent like one person with 1 point, it seems a bit like, you know, like it's just about numbers and it's not really about the impact. So, you know, because of that, we had like different iterations of the draft to try to make it as sensitive and, you know, as powerful as possible. And so I think for, you know, journalists who work on data-driven stories specifically, for us, writing with sensitivity sometimes is a bit difficult. It's quite a task. It seems easy, but it's quite a task, especially if, you know, data is doing most of the storytelling. And so this is where you require, you know, skills as a journalist. And yeah, this is where the writing skills comes in. And I guess another point that usually when I write about impacted communities, I often read and listen to other journalists in the impacted regions. I refer to a lot of their works. I listen to podcasts. I, see how they discuss the topic. And it's not just in terms of like gathering information for the content. It's also about like how they talk about it and how they write about it. Those are the things that I usually sort of take note of as well as a journalist who, is very far from the scene, who is in a, very comfortable place, not really understanding the severity of the problem that these people are facing. I think listening to people from there who are impacted is also very important. That's why in some of our stories, we actually, if we can, we interview people who are actually impacted, and then we insert them as audio files. So basically letting the reader be like, listen to them instead of us, just listen to them, listen to what they have to say. So that's also one way we make our story, very relatable and personable and also meaningful, without it, being too like, without it being too cold, basically. Yep.
No, I think that was very well said. I don't really think we have, I have a lot to add to that. It is, except that we try and bring as honest an approach, as open and as transparent an approach. We look at it via, let's say, public consultations which happen, and we get people again who have participated in our workshops, etc., to sort of to participate with some kind of a guided response on it. Anyway, they have the opportunity to personalize, give more feedback, participate or not participate. So these are some of the things that we leave to our participants. But we do believe that it does have, people who are resonating, let's say, with climate are also resonating very strongly with climate justice, rights of migrant workers, just transition. So these are all narratives which fit in quite easily. I'm not saying that it is an easy transition. It's a very, very difficult transition. But yes, they do resonate with people. It's just that we are all looking for that magic sort of pill on how one can address these, how we can sort of address these big issues with the least with the least inconvenience to ourselves. And it seems like it is going to be quite a challenge. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, the next question would be, so there's often a standard for communications to be more objective or neutral in order for it to sound reliable. And what are your views on what it means to be neutral when it comes to climate change or just transitions issues? And is it important for you to maintain a balanced stance? And maybe for this question, we can start off with Rahul first.
Yes, sure. So I'm just gathering my thoughts on that, but could you repeat it? Sorry.
Yep. So what are your views on what it means to kind of maintain a neutral stance when talking about climate issues? Is it important for you? Do you think it's important to sound balanced or be so-called neutral when talking about climate issues?
Yes, that's very intuitive. Yes, of course, we need to be very, very, very neutral, non-judgmental about it. This is the state of the planet. This is what we have sort of brought it to, and one of the basic reasons that we sort of have to keep it that way is so that we do not alienate our participants. Our participants who have come in, and so through both the climate stress workshops and climate conversations, we maintain a very neutral stand. We do leave it to we leave it to the people to make their own judgments, to make their own to start their own, let's say, journey on the path. Sometimes people will see it in far greater clarity. They will see the injustices very, very strongly. Some will see the injustices, let's say the unjust transition, the way we have developed as a little bit less they will see it as having been less fair to a number of people. That is definitely the truth. But we do not make a judgment call on that. We leave it to people because everyone is in a different journey. we all want them to, at some point within their hearts, through their values, connect with this big, grasp it wherever they feel they are comfortable, and make the change that they think that they are willing to make. So everyone doesn't need to make all the changes, but we allow them to make the changes that they think they are comfortable making, so that we can all enroll. We are all enrolled as in a society. We are all enrolled in taking some kind of climate action, and maybe if we have that, we might have a very large transition far more effortlessly. So yeah, so we keep a very, very neutral stand. We do not force anybody. We do not force our views on anybody. It's up to the participants to grasp what we are sharing with them. And we have never been disappointed by that approach.
I guess, so for us, it's a little different because we sort of, our audiences are not that close to us in a sense. And so I think the style of writing and journalism is also a little different. So at first, when I read the question, it was like, how do you be, like, when I first read the question, I thought when you said neutral, I thought it meant like, I don't know, denying climate change versus admitting climate change, which I was like, what? I was like, obviously, we can't stay neutral. So yeah, so my answer is a little different from Raju, but basically, obviously, as much as possible, we try to talk about climate change in the way that it is, as Raju mentioned, how severe it is. And in that sense, I guess it's about presenting facts as it is. But I guess for us, I think there is a need to acknowledge that when it comes to the climate crisis, energy issues or natural disasters or development issues, there are accusations that can be made for the topic. And because of Singapore's laws, journalists have to be very cautious about what they write and how they write it. So an example that I'm thinking of right now is, so basically one of our stories that we are currently working on, very broadly, is just about sand mining. And so sand mining is not really so much a energy issue, but more of a land reclamation issue, but it's still very much an environmental issue because Singapore is one of the biggest importers of sand, and we basically take it from our neighboring islands who are slowly depleting. But it's a very taboo topic to talk about. And I've had experienced journalists tell me that if you write that and you publish that, you will get shut down. So in that sense, then it's like, okay, how do we write about sand mining, which is a very important topic that people might not even know about Singapore? How do we bring it across to them to let them know that this is an issue that, this is an environmental issue that we're facing, but also not get in trouble for it? So in that sense, it's like, that's my definition of neutral. When you asked, that was the first thing that came to my mind. Those are the instances where I feel like I really have to, write in a sense that's like, I have to put my passion and my arguments aside for a minute and just write, in a way that's very nuanced. And I think, I guess another example I have, it's also not an environmental example, sorry, but recently we wrote a story about immigration detention in Hong Kong. And obviously it's a very, very sensitive topic. It's a huge problem, but the task was that we cannot problematize it in our story. We cannot say it's a problem because the Chinese government will not be happy with that. So then again, it's about neutral writing, right? But how do you write so neutrally about a topic that has impacted so many people so negatively? It's basically a controversy. So yeah, those are some of the considerations that we have to have, even as environmental journalists. Yeah.
Yeah, I kind of stand with Gwyneth on this point. I feel like for us, working in this space, especially if you're covering the climate crisis, neutral is such a passive word. For example, if I were interviewing for a new candidate it's applying for a journalist position in eco business, I don't want that individual to be neutral about the climate crisis. And from what we've shared earlier on so many of the questions, I think it's quite evident that we're not neutral about like what's happening, and we do have passionate views. But at the same time, I think this role of being a journalist, I mean, I think when we're talking about communications in general, what I mentioned earlier, there are different types of communicators. There are definitely the activist voice that is already in the space whereby you strongly advocate for a cause. And I think for journalists, for example, in eco business, all of my colleagues have their pet causes. Some are, for example, vegan, some are animal lovers, and we all have our causes that we stand for. But at the same time, in this professional role as a journalist, I think the fact that you are reporting on the climate crisis and you have chosen this vocation by itself is also already kind of like a resistance a resistance act that you're putting up. But I do value objectivity though, although what I said about neutral earlier on was quite strong, but I think objectivity in this case, I think when Gwyneth was sharing this example just now about reporting on Southeast Asia and then actually listening and reading so much about it to get that tone, I think a lot of writers would recognize that discipline and hard work behind this thing. It wouldn't really show in, I mean, it's not evident for the reader sometimes when they read the writing that this amount of legwork is done. But I think it is just respect for the profession when you actually try to, I mean, sometimes when you say balance and objectivity, I don't think it's a forced balance whereby you just report on the A side and then the B side. I think it is really striking that correct tone that actually does justice to the topic that you are working on. And I think that is key to what we do. And obviously also to be as clear and as accurate as we can. So I think that is how I will tackle that question. Yeah.
Okay, I think we don't have much time left, so I'll kind of address some of the audience questions. And I think the next one is quite relevant to what we were saying, because I think all three of you panelists have so much passion for environment, right? And at the same time, you have, I think we were saying that we still kind of have to tone down that passion a bit when it comes to writing in order to sound balanced. So how one question from an audience is, how important is personal voice in the pieces you create? When and how do you bring it in what form? And especially as individuals representing larger organizations in your writing and speech.
Yeah, I guess I can quickly go first. I think with journalism, there are various ways we can do that. We have pushed out very audience-specific regional newsletters, for example, whereby the editors as well as the correspondents covering the specific areas, as well as through our weekly newsletters, actually bring a more personal as well as sometimes even a strong voice in giving our opinions about the issue. So in that newsletter, the news would be presented as it is, but then we kind of like add that extra voice to it by, I mean, in terms of curation as well as writing about it. And definitely also commentary comes into play. For example, I said a few of my colleagues are at COP27 right now. And I think the reminder that the editors have been trying to give is that try to really look for what's happening on the ground and make a difference. I mean, the fact that you are reporting in Egypt as compared to when you're just writing up the stories from Singapore should make a difference, I think. And I think in that case, it's not only personal voice, it's also personal observations and like people that you talk to and how do you like bring that in. And yeah, as individuals representing larger organizations, I think the clear thing is the organization's values and objectives have to be very clear and sometimes even spelled out for even like our partners or our readers in terms of content guidelines. So then in that sense, I think journalists working for the organizations are very clear about what the organization stands for. And yeah, I think we are quite clear about that. Even for example, when we post on social media, who we represent, and how do we strike that correct tone.
Thank you. Can we have maybe Rahul next?
Yeah, sure. So I won't add too much, excepting, I mean, just maybe a little bit of a tangential, but bit of a relevant thought on that. That often when we are talking to people in organizations, we find that as individuals, people have not only, a lot of people have personal stories to share, and sometimes their connections are actually different from. So we connect a lot with the people, with the person inside an employee, let's say, so even in a large organization. And sometimes we find that people are not really willing to, let's say, talk from the organizational perspective, because they feel that there's a lot more that perhaps could be done at an organizational level. So our appeal to them through our conversations, through the workshop, is actually at an individual level, and for them to be able to then orchestrate some change. It's again the cultural shift that we try and aim for, to make that cultural shift by reaching out to people, whether you are in an organization, you're in a community group, you're in a yoga group, wherever you are. So again, sometimes it is often easier to reach out to individuals, and we have actually felt that in an organization space, they feel hampered about expressing their views in case it does not align as much. Their values are seen as not aligning completely with organizations.
Yeah, I think most of my points are pretty similar to what both panelists have mentioned. So yeah, having a passionate voice, a strong voice, where the opinion is, maybe it's not the forefront of the story, but it's very clear to the reader. I mean, you're not writing it in first person, but definitely there is a way to write about a topic where the topic is the focus, but the author clearly has a voice. And I guess like for Conti, we're a private company, so we have a little bit of liberty with sharing with our personal voice. We don't really have to make it like an opinion piece, and so because of that, we also take like for instance new narrative like Our Grandfather's Story, even Woke Salarymen sometimes, to see like their tone, because those are some of the organizations that are very good at using personal voice to like incite some sort of response in their audience. So yeah, we sometimes get a bit of inspiration from that. So the thing about personal voice is that it connects us with the audience, right? I mean, the climate crisis, it's an ongoing discussion, ongoing conversation, and basically the work that Raju and her team does is doing this, is reaching out to the audience to connect to them as much as possible. So for me and Wyman, we are writing it from the screen and we're not really reaching out to these people. So that's when personal voice is really very essential, because if you write it in a too like neutral tone, people don't really know who you are. It takes them out of the story and they don't really want to come back to your site to read more about what you have to say about the topic. Yeah, but of course, as we mentioned just now, it really depends on the story. Sometimes some topics, if you have too strong a personal voice, that can be a problem. So yeah, it really depends on the story, but most of them obviously would recommend, if you're going to write about an environmental topic, if you're passionate about it, the audience would like that a lot more than if you were like very neutral about it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So it's almost 2:30, but I'll just bring in one last question to end off. So this question is, what's the most effective way to mobilize people through communication? And I think we probably have already addressed a bit of this throughout the whole panel, but if you have any last words you want to say, you can add it in here. Yeah.
I guess I'll go first for the last question. Okay. Okay, so yeah, so basically for our stories, we have a call to action. Every single story has a call to action, and a lot of our writers, we take courses and we learn about how to engage our audience and make them move, basically. So one of the skills that we learned was, having clear action goals, and sometimes even spelling it out step by step for the reader, rather than like broad claims and, just telling the reader, this is roughly what you can do. Those are the small things that really help. But I guess I guess later the two other panelists will talk a little bit more about this, but for Kontinentalist, because we are data driven, we always encourage our readers to question the data. So that's also one way they can engage it. So for Conti is we also promote data literacy, because nowadays, especially after the pandemic, data is everywhere. Everyone loves data. Everyone wants to present data, but obviously there's false news, there is PR news, there's like certain statistics that looks good, but actually isn't good. So we really do encourage our readers to practice data literacy. And we have like a little campaign on our Instagram page that is basically like a series of episodes of how people can question what they read and how they can, and we even talk a little bit about the basic concepts of statistics and things like that. To basically like engage our audience and make them question, like even when it's a piece that's written by us, you should still question it, like don't just like absorb it. And I think having that sort of audience is very important.
I can just share that I guess because we are business facing, there is also that element of a lot of communication behind the scenes, whereby we are trying to persuade or convince organizations to, for example, alter some of their messages, or actually when they're working on, for example, a story with us, try not to focus, for example, on their corporate message that much, but what it actually means for people. I think there's a lot of behind the scenes communication with these key partners to get the more valuable and meaningful stories out. But at the same time, I think for eco-business, because ultimately we're a media and journalism organization, I don't think mobilization per se, except for the broader climate cause, I don't think we really write for a specific cause so much that it diminishes our role as a journalist. I think that is still like first and foremost, most of us really stand by some of like the more journalistic conventions. So we really try to let our work speak for itself.
Very quickly, I can resonate quite strongly with Gwyneth on that. We, part of our conversations, call to action, verbalizing what is the action that you can actually take in a bunch of your friends. When you do that, that's actually far more likely that you are going to follow through with that action. So that is something that we do. In addition, we also have a change theory wherein we discuss all the kinds of social movements that have actually happened in the past few years, even the past couple of 100 years. We look at some great examples like the end of slavery, women's voting rights, etc., etc. So how did this change actually happen? And that's one of the very, very, very empowering parts of our conversation, where the participants realize that actually to make that change is not very difficult. And when we share this, follow it up with a call to action. We tell them that's when, and so many examples right now, plastic straws getting banned, etc., entire countries. So there is climate action happening, and we just, for some of the things that seem slow to happen at the moment, that's a build-up in action. We're reaching that critical 16-18% that we need for actually change to happen. And that's really just part of our so we use those great tools to get people to be mobilized and actually following through with their actions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, all three panelists. So I think that's all the questions that we have for now. And I think that was a nice way to kind of end off the panel with call to actions about call to actions. And I also have a call to action for our audience members. So as we wrap up, we just want to thank our speakers again for sharing your insights and experiences with us this afternoon, as well as our speech-to-text interpreters, Sheila and Clara. And if you have any feedback and thoughts on this event, or any ways that you would like to get involved with Energy CoLab for future engagements, do scan the QR code on the left of the screen. And this panel is also a part of a 2-day community conference. We will also be having 3 in-person workshops, as well as a human library segment next Saturday, 12th November. So we highly encourage you to check that out as well by scanning the QR code on the right. And that's all for this panel today. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And Yep. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you for all the sharing.
Thank you for attending this panel.